Yeah. So, okay. So if you have listened, I wasn't sure if you had, but you kind of know the format. So really
Mhm.
I was diagnosed last year and I don't often get to I don't often get to interview women who were diagnosed in childhood just because you guys are unicorns, right? So
That's also partially why I reached out because I was like, all of these women are so interesting, but like, I feel like I didn't realize I was a unicorn until I like started to do more research. And I was like, oh my God, what,
right?
how is this possible?
Your parents were pioneers. That's what it was. I think it really comes down to like, some of the things we talk about so much, which are like the signs were there all along. How did nobody pick this up? And it's just, it wasn't part of our language,
Yeah.
20, 30 years ago. I don't know. I'm 46, so I don't know how old you are, but like this
I'm
was like the
I'm
80s.
Yeah, I'm 33, but I will also say I think I was diagnosed early because I was dyslexic. So I was already getting tested for other things.
Mhm.
Whereas my sister, who's younger than me, I got her diagnosed in college. And
Mm.
so, like, here's my parents who were just as observant of me and all of my habits who completely missed my sister. So I could definitely talk about that. I'm sure she'll be like, "Thanks, Alex," but whatever. Um, I coach her from time to time too, so it's all good. She won't care that much. Um,
It amazes me how many women I've interviewed who had siblings who were diagnosed in childhood and they ended up being like the good kid, the easy kid,
mhm,
and how that pressure of being the easy kid really kind of formed who they were in adulthood with a lot of
totally,
anxiety and a lot of that depression and not sort of being able
totally.
to advocate because you were sort of the one who didn't who didn't ruffle feathers. And it's
That, but like,
amazing.
I would also say that just because I was diagnosed younger doesn't mean that all of those things that you mentioned didn't exist. They absolutely did, but they were for totally different reasons.
Right? Yeah, that's the other thing. I think the first time I interviewed somebody, a woman
Mhm,
who was diagnosed in childhood, was Elizabeth Brank. And it was really
mhm,
eye-opening because so much of an adult diagnosis involves that grief, right? Involves that like what could have
totally.
been. And
Yeah,
she really opened my eyes up to just like even when I was diagnosed, there's so much you don't understand at the time. There's so much in which our understanding of ADHD changes and comes and goes. So it was really, I'm always fascinated to hear your perspective. So
yeah, yeah.
let's backtrack a bit and
Okay.
officially get started because we could
Yeah,
probably
great.
just chit chat the whole time.
Totally. Totally.
So you were diagnosed at the age of 8 with dyslexia and ADHD at
Hmm.
the same time, correct?
Hmm.
Okay. And
Hmm.
so I have heard you on some other podcasts talking about that, but why don't you
Oh,
talk about like what were some of the signs that your parents first were alerted to that made them kind of go down this road as the neurodivergent pioneers that they were?
yeah. I really started because of the dyslexia piece. I think I was going into third grade, and my parents were like packing me up for sleepaway camp. It was my first summer at sleepaway camp. Hashtag this was my white privilege of like we had means, we had a lot of resources. This was the reality of what my experience was. But my mom was packing me for camp, and she's like, "Do you want to pack some books?" And I was like, "Why? I can't read." And she was like, "Wait, what?" Like I knew you didn't like to read. I didn't realize that you couldn't or felt like you couldn't. They had talked to my all of my teachers, and all of my teachers were like, "What are you talking about? She's so articulate, she's so vocal, she participates in class. Like, I don't know what you're seeing." And therefore the school district wasn't planning to do any kind of intervention or do any kind of testing whatsoever because I was quote unquote fine. And my parents were like, "No, if she's vocal enough to tell us that she can't read, she probably can't read." So I got all these testing done, and it was like I had dyslexia, I had ADHD, I was needing all kinds of services, and our school district wasn't providing any resources whatsoever. So we had to move. And that really changed the game because the new school district that we moved to had everything under the sun in terms of support. But it really started with the fact that I was vocal enough to say, "I can't read." But all of my anxiety, when I think back to that time, and I actually just recently found a folder in my bedroom in my parents' house of my official diagnosis from when I was 8 years old, and the anxiety that was written of how my parents described me at that time made me want to cry because I was experiencing so many other symptoms that the pediatrician was like, okay, I didn't want to eat, or I would only eat certain things, but it was all about having control, or I was very self-conscious of being called stupid in class. And again, I was 7, 8 years old and vocalizing this. And I would have hoped that they would have brought me for psychological testing in any way, shape, or form at that point, because the amount of anxiety that was being written was pretty prevalent, which I vaguely remember, but not as much as when I read it.
Yeah, when I went back and looked at my report cards, because long before my diagnosis, I thought I had an undiagnosed learning disorder. I often wondered, I think as a lot of us do, I often wondered if I had undiagnosed dyslexia because I really
Mm,
struggled with reading in terms of focus, right? The attention,
hmm
rereading paragraphs over and over again. And then now, through my children, I learned about dysgraphia, right? And
hmm
my handwriting was always an issue growing up. And so there was I don't know if you can hear the sirens. Sorry.
I can. It's okay.
I'm not even in New York. You're the one who should have the sirens.
Trust me, I probably will. It's fine. It's fine.
And so, I went back and looked at my report cards, and I was, so overwhelmed by the sort of just the nitpicking, right? And I felt like it was just this like constant every year. It was like, Katie's great. She's an enthusiastic member of the class, but handwriting, but focus,
Mm.
but talks too much. But and I wonder, like, do you feel like people who are neurodivergent are just like more sensitive to the buts? Or is it really just like we do, because there's that fact of, or there's that fact that's tossed around a lot, which is like we hear
Huh.
10,000 more criticisms than your average child, which I
Right.
100% believe. But then I also
Right.
wonder, like, do we tend to focus on the criticism more because of the novelty and the drama of criticism? I don't know if this is just off the
I
top of my head. You know what I'm talking
No,
about though?
I
Like,
totally do. And I actually am thinking very specifically about all of the files that I went through with all of the different report cards, because the teachers who gave me the most anxiety, who stressed me out the most, who were the most difficult to work with me personally, or work with my resource room teachers or anything like that, were the ones that gave me the biggest criticisms, and the one who um, made me the most miserable in class. And it wasn't that I was a miserable student. It wasn't that I wasn't a hardworking student. It wasn't that I didn't try. It was that for some reason, these particular teachers who had one school of thinking and I didn't fit it, thought if I push her harder, she'll do it. But that criticism made me feel worse. And those were all of the negative comments I had in every report card I've ever had. So I I don't know if it's necessarily it's like the chicken or the egg. Was I
mhm.
responding a certain way because of how they were teaching me and I didn't understand? Or was it the fact that I was more sensitive to feeling like the outcast and therefore I acted differently in those classes? I'm going to say it's the latter.
Yeah, I know it is because I think we're told we have so much potential, right? And so there's always that underlying
I was actually
subtext.
told that never,
Oh, okay.
never.
Now, do you think that's
Um,
because of the label of the learning disability? People kind
a
of like,
100%. That was one of the most frustrating things for me. And that's actually why I've had this dream of starting my business since I was 16, was that I had this um, SAT tutor who told me when I was looking to apply to big state schools and I wanted a whole rah rah experience and all of these different things, told me that when she saw my SAT scores that I should be applying to liberal arts colleges, small community colleges, then transfer, that whole process. And I was like, do you not see me as a whole person, or do you just see the diagnosis? And she's like, it doesn't matter what I see you as, because on paper, that's all you represent. And that was the kind of dialogue that was said to me so much that I just sat there and was angry about it all, because I was like, I was president of like two different clubs by my senior year of high school. I was active on several sports teams. I was in theater. I was really good at a lot of things. I was in marching band. Like I was the leader of my section. It was like all these different things that I was like, okay, those are also on paper. So why don't you see those too? And
Mm.
that was something that I kept in the back of my head of like, I want to support other people who have a learning disability or ADHD to see the positives in themselves and to see the strengths that they have, because there are so many strengths that we have that other people don't have. I mean, this ability to be able to see the big picture and the little details all at once, to be able to read a room and have that emotional intelligence because of dyslexia and ADHD. I'm so much more observant to everything around me. Those are really big qualities that have value. And so I wanted to support other people, and I was going to find a way, no matter what my next phase of life was going to be, to support other people that were struggling with that, because nobody wants to feel like shit.
Mhm. Yeah, I think in general, from the women I've interviewed and also from my own experience, the level of sort of empathy and advocacy that we
Totally.
use in our life in terms of like wanting, I look back through my life and it was always like I was always like coaching young girls, and I was like a running coach and doing Girls on the Run, and like always wanting to help others in that way
Mm,
of like, so much of our childhood is defined by that struggle, right? Of just
hmm
like feeling like you just weren't getting it, and or you were letting yourself down or letting people down, or just like you said, like not understood, or feeling like you were different from how you were being perceived, quote unquote, on paper.
hmm
Right. And so I think it amazes me how many of us have really kind of dedicated our lives to like, oh my goodness, I really need to help people with it. Like if somebody is out there right now who is struggling, if I can help one person, it will make it all worth it.
Yeah, and that was what was also really frustrating, was, being told by educators that I was one thing, but no one that I actually interacted with felt that way.
Mm,
Um, was very confusing, because it was like, okay, if you think I'm smart, if you think I'm a good problem solver, if you think I'm all these things, how come no one else sees it? It was like, am I wearing this cape that nobody sees? All of that sits there, and yeah, I wanted to be that support for other people and not make them feel invisible.
mhm. So now, what was your education journey like, beyond high school?
So I went to Indiana University, which, you know, that SAT tutor didn't expect that at all. But I went to IU, which is this massive university, and I struggled finding my way through a large university campus, but I eventually found my way because I knew how to advocate for myself. I knew how to get the attention of my professors and locate the best places to study. It took me a while, but I figured it out. And I was actually very close to the director, now former director of disability services at Indiana. And she used to call me every semester to say, like, okay, well, you figured this out. Do you think you can meet with this other student and show them what to do and all these different pieces? And I got to junior year, and I finally said to her, I was like, this is a really large university with over 1,000 students who use disability services. Um, Now it's almost 10,000, by the way. Why don't you have a program that supports other students with disabilities, that in like a mentor way? And she said, we just don't have the time or the motivation to do it. And I kind of said to her, I'm like, okay, well, can I be your time and your motivation? She's like, sure. Can you also meet with the student next week? And I was like, yes. But I came in with a PowerPoint presentation of how I was going to create what I called Peer Undergraduate Mentor Program, or PUMP, which was a mentor retention program that supported students of all kinds of disabilities to help them stay in school, but also find other students that they could talk to and engage with that would support them throughout their journey in graduating college. So it won a ton of awards from the university and the city. So I thought, now I figured out everything. I knew how to navigate through high school. I knew how to navigate through college. I knew how to support other people to do it. When I graduated and started working, nothing exists for adults in the
Mm,
workplace. All of the resources that I had gotten very used to having in school didn't exist. And anything that I had ever taught myself how to do in school was apples and oranges. And so I was so frustrated thinking, I am the person who is most likely to succeed in this scenario. I was diagnosed young. I had resources. I went to a big university and had resources there. I created this program. If I'm struggling, how is anybody succeeding in this? And that was something that was really eye-opening and frustrating for me. So my education kind of, you know, took a turn in that way of, now I have to educate myself and educate others along the way. So it's certainly been a process.
yeah, that's incredibly insightful for to be that young. Did you so did you what sorry. Um what was the transition from understanding these, making these connections and um putting these connecting the dots, and then getting into coaching and consulting?
So you're saying connecting the dots from graduating college, starting
Well, just
work,
for
and then,
yourself, connecting the dots for
yeah,
yourself in terms of, realizing how important it was to kind of advocate and have accommodations, and then actually making a business out, making this your career.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I've had this idea since I was 16, but really the eye-opening piece for me was I started my first job and I was in this open office space and I had spoke openly about the fact that I was dyslexic and had ADHD. And I was so used to communicating that and having the person on the other side of the desk understand what I was asking for and what my needs were, that I was not expecting for them to say, well, why is this hard? Why can't you do this? All these things. Or when I asked for something, why do you need this? It was just, I was really startled by that. And I also had a lot of panic attacks because I was constantly fearing that I was going to fail, that I was not going to have enough time to do this, or that now that I've been interrupted 17 times in the course of an hour, how was I going to complete this before this meeting? And is it going to be something that has all these mistakes? I mean, I was working in program and leadership development for almost a decade, actually a little longer than a decade. And I had actually been laid off from my job due to COVID. And I was thinking about what I was going to do next. And I just didn't want to go back into the same kind of corporate environments, creating programs and leadership development pieces for other people. I was always doing it with this lens of supporting adults with learning disabilities. I was even sought out for my last job before I was laid off because of COVID, because I was dyslexic and had ADHD, because I was able to see things in a much clearer sense and take very, very complicated information and create it in a way that was simplified on so many different learning levels. And I was just sitting there thinking, like, if I'm doing this for other people, I need to do this for the people that I have always wanted to support. And that's kind of how it transitioned. And I don't think that any of the jobs that I had in the past were, you know, as startling as they felt at the time. I think they were incredible learning experiences that led me to this. But I was already supporting people, and now I just needed to support the people I wanted to.
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation I have a lot on this podcast, which is, how difficult it is to kind of talk about, right? Like when I was diagnosed, I was shouting it from the rooftops because it was the greatest thing that
Hmm.
ever happened to me. It felt like such a
Hmm.
revelation in terms of my inner narrative and the way I spoke
Right.
about myself, right? And I was fully on board with like, this is a superpower and oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. But then once I started to realize and I'm obviously open about ADHD.
Okay.
I can't not be with, and I'm trying to kind of um, deconstruct so much of the stigma and the stereotypes around what it looks like one episode at a time. But
For
like,
sure.
it's so frustrating to realize how being open and labeling yourself with ADHD, or I guess any learning disability, really just like you the way in which you are then perceived by the other person changes so drastically. It's really can be frustrating, because so many other people don't see it as a superpower. They don't see it as this wonderful, amazing way in which you bring so much to the table because of your ADHD. People are like, I'm so sorry. Oh, that's terrible. Hang in there. All of that bullshit, where it's like, I understand why people are not open about it, and they're not like shouting it from the rooftops on their CV in the workplace. But I also understand that like the only way we're going to really, affect change is by being open about it and making it a huge part of our personality and saying, look, this is like, yeah, like, 10% of the people in this room have it, or I'm probably even more,
Right.
but like
Yeah,
it's such this, I don't know, hamster wheel. I don't know, that's not the right analogy, but I feel like, it's the same. I understand. It's almost like how do you take that first step to really be open about it, and yet at the same time you're really risking how you're being perceived by your managers. And
totally. And I talk to a lot of people about this because I would say, in terms of my clients, it's really half and half as to whether or not they decided that they're disclosing that they have a learning disability or ADHD. And it is very much a personal choice. But I will say the most important thing you can do for yourself, whether you have a diagnosis officially or not, is advocating for yourself. And everybody is advocating for themselves, whether it was because of a disability or it was because of COVID and now they have like no childcare at home, or whatever the case is. You can advocate for your needs without exposing yourself or feeling like you're exposing yourself. If you have a job that's very detail oriented and you ask for a list of everything that they want you to accomplish, okay, that's a good thing to have. And nobody's going to think twice for the fact that you're like, I need another list. I just want to make sure that I'm going over everything. Or asking for another set of check-ins with your manager to say, like, can we go over this? I want to make sure you and I are on the same page. Doesn't set off any red flags. And I think there is this underlying fear that you're going to be exposed or that people are going to think less of you. And I do think that there are absolutely jobs where that's the case. But I think the best thing you could do for yourself is learn about yourself so that you can put yourself in environments that are supportive of how you think and learn and do your job. And that's something that no one really talked to me about when I graduated. And that was something that was also very frustrating. Was I would have asked very different questions about my work environment. I would have asked very different questions about the support that I was going to get from my manager at the time. I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't know the questions I could have asked. And again, I was in this role of I know how to advocate for myself, and I didn't. So it's really it is such a full-fledged issue all the way around, but I don't think that it's something that can't be managed in a way that makes you feel better about your skills, your abilities, your strengths, and how you can effectively do your job.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we live in a culture, a Western industrialized culture. I think, self-reliance is a moral virtue, right? So it's like we are taught from a very young age that we are somehow that we're broken if we can't figure things out on our own. We are not taught to advocate on any level. And I see that with my children now in school, like how asking for clarification from their teacher is so hard because they are told by their teacher, like, to stop asking questions, like it's really inconvenient to be in a system where you're asking questions and asking for clarifications and saying,
That's
this is
so
what I
messed up.
need. It is so messed up. And then they're shoved out and, they graduate and they're thrown into adulthood. And it's like, no wonder, none of us like, no wonder it's so physically painful for us to do these seemingly simple things and asking for help and accommodations and realizing that like we are not the problem. Like I talk about this all the time, which is like we are not, the simple like changing of that narrative, which is like there's nothing wrong with you there. You're stuck in a system that's not working for you at the moment, or a structure or a situation, right? So like figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, but I think communicating is the best possible way to find the solution to whatever the problem really is. That is so upsetting to me that your kids are told they can't ask questions. How can a class full of like 30 kids all understand at the same level and the same pace and all understand immediately as if it was like brushed off? I mean, that's not realistic for a lot of learning styles, let alone someone who has a learning disability or ADHD. That's really sad.
Yeah. And I think it's also similar to the idea of like, you want to be the good kid, you want to be the easy kid, you want to be the one who like helps the teacher get through the day because teachers are so stressed and there's always the rowdy kids in the back that they're always having to deal with. And so I always, I think about my two kids who are just like, they just want to be good kids. And
Yeah.
and I think that being good is synonymous with not needing anything, right? And I see
Mm,
how that kind of is ingrained in their personalities now, and it's really sad because I'm like I see the
I,
anxiety that they come home with every day of just like holding it together.
I totally get that because I think for a lot of reasons, I was that kid who just didn't want to be seen as someone bad or someone, picked on by my teacher. I was picked on by a lot of teachers throughout school. It's truly like traumatizing when I think about it. But I wanted to fly under the radar for so many different reasons. But the teachers that I had the best relationships with and the ones that I learned the most from were the ones that I actually asked questions and took the time to stay after class and really meet with them. They got to know me better. That I was mentioning that director of disability services when I was at Indiana. For some reason, someone thought it was a really good idea for me to take something called finite math, which is all word problems. I'm dyslexic, have reading comprehension issues. I am terrible at math. Why would anyone think that was a really good idea? But for some reason, I was now stuck in this class. And this professor had been there for God knows how long. And I met with him. His class was 3 days a week. I met with him 3 days a week. I went to his office hours 3 days a week. I went to meet with him personally one on one. In addition to that, I had him set up a tutor for me. I was still getting a D in his class, but he personally wanted to make sure that I passed the class. And he went to disability services, got my test read for me on a CD, came in at a different day at a different time for me to take the test separately from everybody else. And when I told this to the director of disability services, she said, "How did you do that?" And I was like, "I just talked to him and I was showing him I was trying." And she goes, "He's never been supportive of our department once in 40 years." And it was all because I took the time to talk to him, to get to know him, to show him I was trying. And I didn't get a D in that class. I got a D plus, but I passed. And you know what? It was the hardest class I've ever done, but it took like breaking down this guy who was unbreakable to make a difference. And he remembered me when I graduated. And I think that there's something to that. I worked really hard and I'm really okay to make the adjustments, ask for help, and connect with them.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Did it come on? Did it come out? Okay. Can you hear me? All right. Um, yeah. And I think that also comes back to a conversation that I have a lot in terms of like the privilege and accommodations when you're a child, right? And how that idea that like, I am trying, how that can be overlooked in so often with so many kids, right? Which is like the disruptive kids or the ones who are spacing out and like do it, so many ways in which that sense of like, I am trying gets overlooked and you just end up being pigeonholed as the behavioral problem or the flake or the one who talks too much, and again, it's sort of like, it makes it really difficult to advocate for yourself because you feel like you aren't understood fundamentally.
Yeah, I'm a huge there's a lot of problems with the show Friends, but it's always been one of my favorite shows. But I always think of this one episode, it's this Thanksgiving episode where they're playing football and Joey rips or Chandler goes to throw the ball to Rachel, and who's been missing the ball the whole time. She almost catches it. And she goes, I almost caught that one. He goes, great. Now the score is 7 to almost 7, as if like what she was doing didn't matter. And I was like, oh my God, this is so real. This is so real. This is like everything that I've ever experienced of I'm not good enough. And the thing is, I always try and look at this in a totally different perspective of that's the standards that somebody else has set. Those are not the standards in which you should feel like you have to meet all the time. And the reason we feel like failures is because we're set up in a way that doesn't make sense to us in a scenario that is not going to result in anything positive. So I always try and say like what does success look like for you and how can we create just small pieces and tangible pieces that make you feel successful because you don't have to do everything all in one day. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to understand everything all at once. What do you understand? What is the one thing we can take away from what you're working on right now that we can move on to the next and say, okay, next piece, because that's where the success is going to come from.
Yeah. I want to talk about that too, because I love how you have the declutter your brain
Hmm.
consultation. It's great.
Yeah.
So I do
Thank
want
you.
to talk about that. But before we get into talking about your business, I have a question because I was a pandemic diagnosis, right? I mean,
Okay.
I was diagnosed. It had been suggested to me for a couple years from my therapist that I should look into it. And I was like, I don't
Hmm.
know what you're talking about. I'm not hyperactive. I didn't have any symptoms as a kid, all of that stuff because of all, I didn't understand what it was.
Right.
And it wasn't until I had a full blown emotional meltdown in the pandemic when my kids were home. And I was like, for some reason, decided this was the time to really focus on my business, that pressure of like, I'm going to redo my kitchen or all those other things that everybody was
Yeah.
putting pressure on themselves.
Yeah.
But I couldn't do anything because my kids were home and my husband was here. And then those were those moments where she was like, you really need to look into this. So,
Hmm.
it became my hyper focus. Once I was diagnosed, it's like I live and breathe ADHD now. And so I feel like I have a very skewed sense of how many women are getting diagnosed right now since the pandemic. It feels to me like everybody and her sister is getting diagnosed because it's all I think about, and people reach out to me all the time. And so I'm curious with your perspective, like, do you feel like there's been a proliferation of diagnoses since the pandemic? And, are people, because we talk about like TikTok videos and the way in which so many people are coming to understand what ADHD looks like and feeling like, oh my God, this explains my whole life. Do you feel like more people are being diagnosed, and are more people are is there some risk that like people are being misdiagnosed, or that there's something else happening pandemic wise?
There's so much with that. The answer is
I know this is
yes,
basically like
to
a
some degree.
PhD thesis I just
No, no,
dumped
no,
in your lap.
a little bit, but I could tell you from what I've been reading, what I've been experiencing, what I've been talking to clients about that first of all, which most people don't know is that the highest percentage of diagnosed people with ADHD is adults. And it's because girls are misdiagnosed as kids because, they weren't the hyperactive, or hyperactive was seen as talkative or chatty Cathy's or whatever term that was used at the time to just downplay anything they were experiencing. Children of color, kids of color, far less diagnosed, even though they're showing the same symptoms as everybody else. I think there is a process in which people are being diagnosed at a higher rate. I would also say on the other end of this that I was seeing a lot more people being diagnosed during the pandemic. Um, Not in my favorite reasoning why, but a lot of parents were trying to get their kids diagnosed so that they could put them on medication in order to sit in front of the screen for 7 8 hours a day. And that to me was a little more alarming of is this just frustration of your kid has to sit for 7 8 hours, so do you, and there's that, or are they being diagnosed now because we know so much more? I think there's a combination of things. I would say that a lot of people who are coming to me are seeking a diagnosis, and that's not something that I personally do. I'm really looking to help you strategize how to cope, all of the different strategies after that. But yeah, a lot more people are being diagnosed because one, they have the time, and two, because of TikTok, three, because they were seeking a therapist maybe for the first time during the pandemic, and that was also something that was brought to their attention. So there's a number of different reasons, and I'm glad that people are talking about it. But yeah, I would say it's not just women. I've been talking to a number of people of color who've also like, I wasn't diagnosed until now. Why? And I'm like, can't tell you specifically why, but um, it's not uncommon. And I
Mhm.
think that people need to feel validated in that way. And I think that's part of the coping of it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the conversation that I'm having a lot with this podcast too, which is sort of like, how important is it to get medically diagnosed? Because so many people feel like, well, I'm not officially diagnosed, but I feel like really like seen and understood by the
Yeah,
literature and everything. And I'm like, well, then you probably have it. So look, like, start hyper focusing, start researching, like, start treating yourself,
right.
get the diagnosis, because I think it's very validating to get the diagnosis, but it doesn't, you shouldn't like wait for the diagnosis before you really start. Like, a lot of this is just understanding who you are and how you operate.
Totally. And I would say that a lot of people that come to me are not necessarily people who have an official diagnosis. And I don't work specifically with people who have a diagnosis or not. Sometimes people are just chronically overwhelmed and don't show any symptoms of ADHD. I'd say majority of them do. But I think it's, as you said, it comes down to getting to know yourself. We've been talking about so many different pieces of in school, how you're taught to do one thing and you really experience it in another. Most people, whether you were diagnosed at a young age or not, don't know themselves well enough to know when are you like really focused? When are you needing a break? When do you um is there something particularly that you get hyper focused on? Is there a certain task that is so overwhelming to you that you continue to do it? If you can journal, if you can write things down about yourself, about your day, about your flow, even if it's a sentence, and pick up on those things, it makes a huge difference because then you can transition your day to really function around you. I mean, this whole 9 to 5 setting that was set by who knows who isn't working for a lot of people, again, because of the pandemic right now, but because of that's not how people think. That's not how people function. I mean, I think it's I don't remember what country is doing it right now. Like maybe it's Finland, but they stopped going from like this 5-day work week to a 4-day work week, and people are more productive because people just sat at their desk and were G chatting or doing something else, looking on social media because they couldn't sit there for all those hours. So I think all of this getting to know yourself is going to make the next step, regardless of whether you're getting a diagnosis, you're seeking a coach, you're seeking a therapist, that much easier. There's no wrong answer. And that's also something to think about.
Yeah. No, I agree with all of that. And I think, again, I'm always curious because I feel like there is a way in which ADHD has been pathologized to feeling, and again, let me start over. I feel like there's a way in which you can, ADHD is being viewed as this thing that needs to be cured, right? And so it's like, let's go, let's get our medication and everything will be great. And that's so misleading. So much of living with ADHD is living with it, right? And really embracing the strengths and really like figuring it out and understanding what it is. It's not this thing that you have to cure.
That's
Uh,
also one of the things that I find that women who reach out to me who did get diagnosed at a young age were put on a medication and then told they're cured. Um, and that infuriates me for 1,000 reasons. I've never been medicated for it. That's my parents never sought that for me. It's never something that I felt was necessary for me. And that's really such a personal decision. But the idea that it's a one cure all piece is frustrating. It takes a lot of work to be able to transition your day and how you think for you in order to be the highest functioning person. And look, not every day is good, not every day is perfect. I spent yesterday for several hours. I had one thing on my to-do list and I could not get myself to do it until like 7 o'clock at night. Some days are just like that, and that's okay. But the idea of allowing yourself to be okay with the fact that not every day is going to be perfect, and just because you took a medication that it should be cured, that's not how this works.
Yeah. I was just interviewing a guest yesterday who, so it hasn't aired. We were just talking, and she had said how when she first listened to my podcast, she heard me talk about ADHD as a superpower, and she was a little disappointed because she feels like, there's a lot of toxic positivity in there. And I was like, that's all I talk about is like whether or not we should call it a superpower or not, because I feel like it's so nuanced and so complicated. And I get, I
Yeah.
feel like it can be, for somebody who is suddenly coming to a diagnosis and realizing like, wow, I did have a lot of struggle in my life, to just be like, congratulations, you have a superpower. It's complicated.
It's totally complicated, and I understand all the complexities of it, especially because as a kid, I didn't want to be seen as different, and I understand people's frustrations with all of those pieces. I do think that there is some unique positive abilities that someone who has ADHD or a learning disability have, which is a superpower. This innate ability to communicate effectively is unbelievable. This ability to see this big picture and the little details is amazing. The fact that you can hyper focus and complete a week's worth of work in 3 hours is amazing when it works to your benefit. Not every day is perfect. And I don't want to dismiss anybody's feeling of um, frustration with that. I am frustrated by my ADHD all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that my skills are valuable or unique and special, and that there are not things that people sought me out for jobs because of those skills. You can have both. And that was part of why I came up with the name of my company, which was Capable, because I wanted people to see their superpowers. Yes, not every day for a superpower is good either. They get defeated too,
Mm-hmm.
but they usually power through and they usually make things better for themselves and for everybody. So I want you to think through that it doesn't always have to be negative, and it's okay even if it feels negative in the moment.
Right, exactly. And I think, what is so revelatory and so transformational about getting this diagnosis is feeling like you can recognize what you bring to the table. You can recognize those strengths and really start to lean into them and start to, use them to your advantage, and start to stop thinking about yourself in terms of all the things that are wrong with you, which I think is what happened to so many of us. Certainly happened to me. I remember the first time I heard somebody call it piece of shit syndrome, where I was like, oh my God, yes, right? Like that
Oh
was
my
what my
God.
therapist, but that was what my therapist saw in me. She was like, oh my God, you're doing all these things. You're being, you're so high functioning and busy and interested in all this stuff, but you think of yourself as being lazy and depressed. And she was like, there's such this huge disparity between who you are and how you're viewing yourself, right? And it was like,
But you're
oh,
also hearing other people tell you
well, yeah,
that you're lazy and
yeah.
all of those things. So now you're believing that narrative, and that's what I talk to a lot of people about. If I were to believe that SAT tutor that I had, that I was really going to amount to basically nothing because of what I was on paper, I probably would have amounted to pretty much nothing because I believe it was on paper. But I didn't believe that about myself, and I think really has pushed me forward through a lot of really very difficult times, but also knowing that within myself that I am special for so many other reasons, and it's okay that it's not for the reasons that somebody else is seeking, and it's okay that not every day is great. Nobody has a perfect day. And I think there's a lot of negative pieces out there. It's okay to have something that's positive and different, and it's okay to reflect on something that is hard, but is also special.
Yeah, I love that. And so with okay, let's talk about capable consulting. I'm getting mindful of the time. So yes, it's
Okay.
CAPE, KAPE.
No, CAPE.
Oh, sorry.
So
Did I say K? Oh, sorry.
yeah.
See,
That's my
it's
dyslexia too, so it's fine.
um yes, I'm like looking at it right behind you too, and I'm spelling it out. Okay,
Yeah.
CAPE, which is lovely. And then you have what you call declutter your brain consultations, which is
Yes.
wonderful. It's basically you help people kind of brain dump and sort through the trash, as I also like to call it.
Yeah. There's this is people used to come to my office and all different jobs that I had and do this anyway. And I was like, I should formally call this something. It's essentially a 30-minute free brain dump where everything that's overwhelming you, let's put on the table, let's reorganize it and shuffle it in a way that actually makes sense to you so that you can move forward and it doesn't have to consume you. So yes, you can check that out on my website. So it's Capeable, so CAPE, capeableconsulting.com.
Yeah, I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And so then once everything is sort of dumped out on the table, then what does the coaching entail? Because I mean, obviously I talk about coaching a lot. I think it's so important for us. But yeah, I want to hear your perspective.
Yeah. So this comes from years of doing program and leadership development. And I have this theory on coaching, which is best principles versus best practices. So best practices assumes that everyone can do the exact same thing and end up with the same results, which if you have ADHD, you probably sought out the 5 best things you could do to function in the workplace. I don't know. I can name 1,000 things that are like that. But
Mhm.
you try a million of them, they never work because they weren't made for you and you fail and you think it's you. So that's what people think of when they think of best practices is those types of tips. I do the opposite. I do something called best practices, meaning we have the same goal in mind of how we want you to succeed, but how we get there is really going to be designed for you. We're going to break it down in a way that's organized and makes sense for you. And so I do a few different types of sessions. One is just this one on one coaching, and I call it getting to know you. And we really break everything down, get to know yourself, get to know your core, get to know how you think, how you learn, how you organize, because you do have the ability to organize in your own way. And we work and move forward from whatever it is that you were struggling with so that you can feel like your best self. And the other is if you're wanting a strategy session, if there's something very specific. I just had a client come to me because they were looking to do a job interview for a new job. And they were like, I want to make sure I'm finding out the right job. So we picked out different job applications for him to apply to, and then met up again before he was to do these interviews to make sure he was asking the right questions for him, find out the right resources for him. So these strategy sessions there's 2 sessions and it could be whatever it is that you're looking to focus on. But all of that can be found at my website and you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to meet with you and help you thrive and feel capable.
Amazing. And now you're on Instagram as well as I am capable, right?
I am capable on
Okay.
Instagram. So again, it's spelled CAPE. I do that because I'm dyslexic and I spell everything wrong. So it's I am capable on Instagram, and then on Facebook and LinkedIn it is Capable Consulting LLC.
Good. Okay. All right. I'll put a link to your website and Instagram. And I know on your website you have links to all of the other social stuff if
Yeah.
people prefer them. Now, if you could rename ADHD to something else, would you call it something a little less confusing and confounding to so many of us? Or do you like
Ooh.
it how it is?
Oh, would I rename it? Um, wow. I can't say that I've been stumped on a question before, but I don't know. I don't know if I would name it any different, but I often think of it as the part that bothers me with ADHD is the disorder.
Mhm.
It's like it's not a like I think of that as disorderly, and I'm like, no, people can organize and be ordered, just not in the way you think of it. So I don't know if there's anything specifically I would change it to, but now I feel so stumped.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I asked this question of all my guests, and then I don't even have an adequate answer. So I always feel guilty when I'm asking people because I'm like, don't worry, we're not officially renaming it. And so some of the answers I get are great, which are just like, I don't know, rainbows and unicorns and glitter and um,
I
but it
Wow, I
is.
really don't know how to answer that one,
Yeah.
and I can't tell you. I mean, Wow, I need to think about that one. I really
You can
need to
get
think
back
about
to
that
me
one.
if you come up with
Yeah.
something.
Okay.
I know that Ned Hallowell and there's a number of ADHD experts who are calling it VAST, which is variable attention stimulus trait. So they're getting rid of the disorder element by calling it traits.
Okay.
And instead of attention deficit, it's variable attention, which I think is a little, equally as confusing if you don't
I
really,
would.
if you're not
I'm
already
not a
immersed
fan.
in the community. I'm not a fan just because vast is already a word, so you can't really just Google it when you find out when you're like, what is wrong with me? Uh,
Yeah, I don't
um,
like any of these. I
yeah,
don't like any of these. Um,
but I do.
I need to think about that
Yeah.
because I don't know what I would change it. As I said, I think the only word that bothers me in it is the disorder.
Yeah, and that definitely bothers me because I do feel like this is a neurotype, and the only disorder, the only disability is from the fact that we're stuck in systems and classrooms, and we're misunderstood. And if we had, I often liken it to being left-handed, right, and being forced to be right-handed. And it's the
And
same with
yeah,
like if you hand me a pair of scissors and then you're like, why can't you use them? I'm like, I don't know, I'm trying, you know
right.
and so it's that same
All
idea of
those
like just
lefty
being
desks.
chronic,
Yeah.
exactly, right? But if you don't realize that those accommodations exist for you, you just sort of stumble through life being like, what is wrong with me that I can't do this and everyone else can?
I saw this somewhere. It might have been a meme. I don't remember where I saw it, but it was talking about how ADHD was like in the caveman era type of thing. We were beings that were hyperactive and constantly being stimulated all the time to evolving into a sitting at a job 9 to 5. And it's like, no, we're not the ones who have something wrong. Society changed around us, and we're just still like in this primal of I got to keep doing something act. And it just made me laugh because, yeah, I don't see it as something wrong. It's just different, and it's okay.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And then, again, I think it becomes problematic when you start to look at medication as like, how can we get a kid to sit in a classroom for 8 hours straight and not move? And you're like, maybe we shouldn't be doing that to children.
I mean, yeah. Look, medication can be an incredible resource for a lot of people, and I'm not opposed to medication, but I think that we're very quick to go to it and assume that everything's cured once we use it, and that's the part that bothers me with it.
I'm the same.
'Cause
I'm not anti-medication. I don't,
no,
but I
not at all.
also, it's the same idea of like, I think it's a very complicated, nuanced issue. And if you think that, taking a pill is going to solve all of your issues, then you need to seek a second opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Like when I was telling you, I had these panic attacks in that first job. I was put on a medication and I didn't have a very good therapist at the time, but like she should have probably said to me like this isn't this isn't working. No, it's but when you're on those medications and you don't really know anything different, it's very hard for you to see outside perspective of that. So,
Oh yeah. Well, I talk about that with depression and anxiety. I mean, I
yeah,
was on a cocktail of antidepressants for years and years and years and fell into that same cycle of like, well, if I'm this bad, the medication wasn't working, and if I'm
yeah,
this bad on the medication, imagine how bad I'll be off the medication. And so I
right.
was terrified to go off of it, right? And so I
Yeah.
think we get into that cycle too, which is sort of like this isn't working for me, but I'm too terrified to think of what I would be like without it.
And I will tell you, I slowly came off of one of those medications I'm no longer on, and it was pretty rough because
Oh,
they're very, very, very powerful medication, very powerful drugs. But it's also something that people don't talk about in relation to ADHD because almost 80% of people who have a learning disability or have ADHD have anxiety or depression or OCD or suffer some kind of mental health struggle. And, you know, I was listening to this podcast from Attitude Magazine that was fascinating, and it was talking about how some antidepressants don't really work well for those who have ADHD because they're supposed to be like they're taking you down, whereas you need the stimulant, and it's like a whole concoction. And because people don't talk about this, people are often who have ADHD on the wrong types of medication. So it's so complicated. It's not one that I can truly talk about on a on a medical stance in any way, shape, or form, and I'm not trying to, but um, my point in saying that is help can be sought, and there needs to be a team of people to help you, and whatever you see fit makes sense for you is the right direction.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
And if you have a medical professional who tells you it's just depression or anxiety and isn't willing to look at some of the underlying
You
causes,
need a new
then
doctor.
you need a second opinion. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed hearing your story. Like I said, I don't often get the unicorn of a childhood diagnosis. So I love your more kind of, laid back. I've seen it. I've been there, done that perspective, because I think it
Yeah.
helps so many of us. I think it definitely helps me to feel like, um, it helps me to get past that sense of like, oh, the life I could have lived if I had been diagnosed as a child. And that this is like, it's a very complicated and nuanced thing to live with.
It's
And
your
wonderful as
story.
well. Yeah.
It's your story. It's your story alone, and it doesn't make it less or more than anybody else's. It's your journey, and how you cope with it and how you deal with it is going to be in your own unique way, no matter what age you get diagnosed. So
Mm,
it's okay.
yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, take care. Bye.